thought I might go a bit bigger picture now to talk about the broader policy trends, which follows on quite nicely from David's final points there. And I want to talk to you about sanctions policy and practice, so really the bigger picture of what's changed over time. First of all, sanctions in context of wider reforms, then the balance between sanctions and support, what's happened on the other side, and then finally I want to do a bit of a plea to you, if any of you could help me find people to interview about their experiences of sanctions. So, as David said, this emphasis on sanctions has been growing over time. We can trace back a sort of individual behaviourist turn in policy back to about 1996 when Job Seekers Allowance was introduced. But it was New Labour who were really keen to make conditional welfare reform happen. So in 2008, is this the dreadful paper we were talking about with Greg? Paper on conditional?
No, there was the Greg report, and then the DWP wrote a separate discussion paper following on from it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in this DWP publication in 2008, they say the principle that aspects of state support, usually financial or practical, are dependent on citizens meeting certain conditions which are invariably behavioural. That was them setting down the principle that behaviour change was what the welfare system was about. From 2010 onwards, this has become more widespread and obviously associated with political consensus. There's no strong political alternative now to welfare conditionality. And Roger observes here, it's a new politics of welfare intent on converting the benefit system to a lever for behaviour change. So what we can see is over time an extension and also an intensification of these behavioural conditions, mainly job-seeking conditions, mainly involving people writing down what they're going to do to find work and surveillance on what they're doing during particular hours of the day to look for work, for example using the computer system, Universal Job Match. That extension is involved, as we know, bringing more and more groups into the sort of conditions that were previously designed only for unemployed people who didn't have impairment and who didn't have substantial caring responsibilities. As David showed us very nicely, sanctions have increased in frequency, duration and severity. I think they're triggered more easily and they seem to accelerate very rapidly. So there was some evidence in the Oakley review of sanctions, especially from Citizens Advice, of some of their clients who had been given a letter saying that they'd been sanctioned for not attending a meeting before they got the letter telling them that they had to attend a meeting, and then they got another letter to say that they'd been sanctioned again, so they'd been accelerated from the first failure to attend to a second failure to attend, without the proper information about the meetings in the first place. And these sanctions are being spread out to wider groups, which I'll come to in a second. An important point is the JSA exits have not been matched by job entries, so people are not leaving benefits into jobs, they are often leaving benefits, end of story. On the support side, mandatory support has also increased, but there's been a reduction, especially for short-term unemployed people, in the type of help you can get in the first instance, and the work programme has been shown by official evaluations to be ineffective. I thought it might be useful to have a wee look at this. This is a detailed overview of what sanctions are for the different benefits. So Job Seekers Allowance, a first low failure to attend offence will result in a 28-day sanction. Second and third offences, 91 days. A medium sanction is failure to be available for work, the consequence disentitlement. A high-level sanction, failure to apply for a job. And then you can see those, excuse me, the ramping up of the sanctions, and then those really big sanctions, the 3-year sanctions for JSA, for ESA, and then universal credit. And there's something interesting here as well with ESA, the 100% sanction until compliance. So that opens up an open-ended sanction possibility. The work programme also, as David highlighted, involves sanctions, but what's interesting is that you can be sanctioned under GSA at the same time as a work programme sanction, so you can have sanctions running together, and you can have a couple of job seekers ones whilst also having a work programme one. Excuse me. Nasty stuff, that's my point with this slide. And then moving into universal credit, what we can see there is ubiquitous conditionality. So conditionality extended to another 1.2 million people, and that will include partners of claimants and those who are in work, which is an interesting and maybe counterintuitive development. Those in work sanctions will be for failure to increase hours of work or failure to increase pay, which, as you can imagine, probably going to be quite difficult for people to control themselves. That's not all. Under universal credit, there's also a fine system, so you can be fined £50 for negligently making a false statement. And under universal credit, it's a digital by default claiming process. So most people will, almost everyone, will have to claim online. So if, for example, you've got a dyslexia type difficulty or a language difficulty, you could quite easily be in this category of negligently making a false statement. So a system of fines alongside a system of sanctions makes this the most punitive system we've ever seen since the post-war welfare state was established. On the support side, well, what's the balance? I guess you might imagine that this very harsh system of sanctions and fines might be balanced with more generous support. Unfortunately, that's not been the direction of travel in employment service provision. Overall spending in employment services in the UK is the lowest in Europe, about 1%. There's no direct job creation and minimal spending on training. So comparative research, which looks at European countries and the nature, the character of the employment services that are provided, highlights that the UK is really a self-help system. It's about each of us, ourselves, finding a job. Job Centre Plus has become residualised, and there's an interesting article, if you've not seen it, by Bruce Stafford, which highlights, it uses the official evaluation, so it's the DWP's own evidence, to show that call centres and digital claims are also related to a strategy to minimise footfall, which quite euphemistically suggests we don't want people to come and speak to us in our offices. Combined with persistent cost cutting and headcount reductions, it means that for most short-term unemployed people, there's really not much in the way of support or assistance provided by DWP. Obviously, that is because of a funding context. So this role of Job Centre Plus is more punitive, it's more about policing than enabling, and it's combined with benefit offload targets. There's been a lot of controversy about these because DWP says they don't have sanctioning targets. But I've heard from several people now that there are benefit offload targets. An offload might be for someone to get a job, another offload could be if someone is no longer able to claim benefits or if they're sanctioned. The evidence on the work programme is not especially encouraging either, I'm afraid. The National Audit Office highlighted over-ambitious job outcome promises, they over-promised, under-delivered, and then in years 1 and 2, a failure to meet minimum service standards. In year 1, no provider met the minimum standard. In year 2, it was slightly better for GSA groups, but not promising for ESA, so only 5% of ESA claimants go back into work through the work programme, rather than the target 15%. Another character of the system is a move towards more automated systems in the work programme and in Job Centre Plus, where sanctions can be triggered automatically by the system. And I was quite surprised actually that you didn't see more failure to attend sanctions, because for advisors, if they are presented with their computer system and their client's not in front of them, there's an automatic process which can trigger the failure to attend sanction. And in the research that I'm doing just now, we've interviewed people who have been sanctioned. One man was disabled and in the job centre building when he was being sanctioned. He was struggling to get up the stairs. Another evaluation of the work programme said that users had been asked to engage in inappropriate or irrelevant activities or to enter unsuitable employment. There's also evidence that advisors adopt some elements of anti-welfare discourse. So the support side is not supportive enough, I would suggest. I just zipped through that much more quickly than I thought I would. So I'll say some things that were on the slides that I took out to be quick. I also wanted to point out that the other parts of the context, two important parts of the picture really, what's happening with unemployment and what's happening with employment. So you might think part of this very tough approach on sanctioning could be justified if we've got a big problem with unemployment or if we've got a big problem with worklessness. But if you look at the statistics, there's certainly historically in the recent past, the last sort of 15 to 20 years, there hasn't been a huge problem with unemployment. I'll qualify that now. If you're unemployed, it's never nice. It's universally a negative experience. A lot of research has shown that. But in terms of international comparisons, the UK has had a relatively low unemployment rate, particularly during the period when New Labour were in office. So there was a decade where unemployment was very low, around 5%. Of course, there were regional variations, and that's another story. But unemployment wasn't peaking, it wasn't at an all-time high, it was at an all-time low. It hadn't been lower since the post-war period. Meanwhile, the employment rate, what do you think was happening with that? Before the recession, before the downturn in 2007. This is a test if we read The Guardian this morning. Do you think well, we do higher and lower. Do you think in 2007, just before the recession, do you think the employment rate in the UK was high or low? Who thinks high? Give me a show of hands. Who thinks it was low? Okay, someone certainty. It was peaking at an all-time high, higher than since comparable records began, which was in 1971. So the employment rate was about 73%. It was one of only, the UK was one of only 5 EU countries with an employment rate above 70%. So a big part of the context is that the UK doesn't have a problem with its employment rate. There are issues about underemployment, and there are many other labour market issues. But this sanctions regime was not introduced in a response to problems with unemployment or problems with not enough people being in work. Obviously, when the recession happened, people lost their jobs, there were a lot of redundancies, but the employment rate has now peaked up again and is now as high as it was before the recession, so it's at its joint peak time since comparable records began. Now, my plea. I'm doing a major study just now about welfare conditionality. We are interviewing 480 people 3 times over the course of 3 years about their experiences of sanction and support. There are lots of people in lots of different situations. There are 6 universities involved with 8 study locations. We're looking for people who have received or been threatened with sanctions or people subject to mandatory support. If you know anyone in any of these groups, migrants, offenders, homeless people, social tenants, or antisocial behaviour order, people who've had an antisocial behaviour order, please let me know, because we really need to speak to people who are in those groups who've experienced sanctions or mandatory support. Thank you.